Welcome to the EdRed podcast, a podcast discussing important issues impacting Illinois public education and the action being taken to address them. Each month, a new episode will be released.
Welcome to episode 2 of the EdRed podcast. Give me the deets on EBF, part 1, featuring Brian Battle and Bob Spatz, both EdRed Executive Board alums, in an in-depth conversation on the development of the evidence-based funding model and their intentions for the formula. This episode is the first part of a 2-part conversation.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our special guests, Bob Spatz and Brian Battle, for joining us today on Give Me the Deets on EBF. I'd love for you both to provide us some background on your involvement in EdRed and public education, as well as, lead us into the conversation on EBF. What led up to the early conversations between the two of you, and why were they so important?
I started attending school board meetings in the early 90s before my child was born. Ended up serving on the Oak Park Elementary District 97 board from 2007 to 2019, on the EdRed board from, I think, 2009 to 2019, was chair for a year and vice chair for a year. But Oak Park was the district that always had to pay very close attention to our funding under the old general state aid formula, the foundation formula. Bounced around. There was a lot of variability in what we would get. There was a lot of variability when we were looking at full day K. There was all this stuff about PTEL adjustment. So I had gotten very familiar with the old formula when it came time to look at a new one as it was beginning to pass. There was gained momentum for Andy Menard's Senate Bill 16 originally in 2014. And then later Senate Bill 1, we realized that the proposals were not serving our districts particularly well, or the EdRed districts well. And because my professional background was in financial databases, I was familiar with working with numbers and lots of numbers, spreadsheets and so forth, said I would help EdRed with an effort to try to understand what was being proposed by Menard, what might be improvements to it. And that was sort of the beginning of things.
So, hello, I'm Brian Battle. I was on the Barrington 220 School Board for 4 terms, 2008 through 2019. And I think I was on the EdRed board for about 8 years, ending in 2019. And I certainly enjoyed my time on the EdRed board, right? As I served as a board president in 220, and getting that external view of the legislative process through EdRed, I think made me a better school board member in Barrington. And I think as part of that, back, when we're talking here in about 2015, right? It was 2015 when we started. There was a lot of frustration with the general state aid formula. Not many people felt it was equitable. There were several, for the previous 3 or 4 years, there had been different efforts to try to revise it. But including in the spring of 2015, there was a big effort to revise it. And the idea was to get more money to schools that people perceived weren't getting enough state aid. But the way that all these bills were going about it was the Robin Hood model, right? By taking money away from some districts and giving it to other districts. Not only is that reallocation process a hard one to do, but I think most school districts kind of objected to just having their state funding just taken away like that. Because, obviously most of our budgets don't have a lot of extra wiggle room, right? So if you start taking revenue away, it gets to be hard. There were many of us within EdRed and elsewhere that felt that there had to be an approach that would not take money away from some districts, right? But would create an avenue for new money into education to be allocated to the needy districts. And I think that there was just nobody working on that. I think we kind of began our work at the fall kickoff for EdRed. We had Senator Jason Barrickman there. And he had been active in a lot of these efforts to revise the general state aid formula. And we talked to him at that event and said, okay, the last effort in the spring failed. What's next? who's working on something different. And he shared that he wasn't aware that anybody was. So we said, okay, well, that's not good, right? And so at our next EdRed meeting, a couple of us stayed after, and Bob and I both said, well, if nobody else is working on something that we feel is in not just the best interest of EdRed, but the best interest of the state, maybe we should take a crack at it. And I think in the next few weeks, we kind of recruited Steve Miller to help us start putting some data together. And that became kind of the way the whole thing got kicked off.
And one of the things that was problematic with the old formula is there was a foundation level, which is what the funding was based on. And then there was an EFAB level, the Education Funding Advisory Board level. And in 2014, the foundation level was at 6119, and the EFAB level was at 8672. It was a $2,500 difference. And that was part of the problem with many of the solutions, is that if you are playing Robin Hood, if you will, taking money from the rich and giving to the poor, that part of the problem was if you calculated it based on the EFAB number, some of the districts they were taking money away from were inadequately funded by the state's own EFAB calculation. Not by the foundation calculation, but by the EFAB calculation. And that sort of is where this concept of adequacy came from, is, don't take away from districts that are underfunded, but are better funded than other districts. And so there was a lot of effort there, because once you realized that the state was underfunding by their own formula by about $5 billion, you realized it wasn't a reallocation of existing dollars. You really needed to talk about new dollars. And that was an important first step, was let's not talk about reallocation, but of a new method to allocate the much needed new dollars, a fairer and more equitable way to allocate new dollars.
And at the time, right, to echo that, at the time, there were legislators who said we would be willing to increase the amount of money the state puts into schools, but we're not comfortable that the existing way we're distributing those funds is equitable or fair. So the implication was, if we can come up with a different methodology that people would look at and say this is equitable and fair, that the state legislature would then back that up by increasing school funding, right, over time. And to us, that was a pretty important objective.
Right.
It's a very complicated formula, and you've kind of already spoken to it a little bit, but could you give us some more of key components of EBF?
Sure, I'll try to do this succinctly. There are sort of 4 separate components, and they were intentionally designed separately so that they could get agreement and could be tweaked independent of each other. The first was to calculate a district-specific adequacy based on their enrollment. Didn't have anything to do with the money available from the state, the money available from the local, but here are the demographics of your district: enrollment, free and reduced lunch kids, and English language learners, and use only those as input and determine what adequacy and adequate funding was. There were models in Vermont and a few other places that we looked at, as well as some that the people in Illinois had been looking at. And Brian, you did a lot of that work.
Yeah, and I think besides, so the adequacy component, right, was kind of that first big building block, right? And it differed from the previous pieces of legislation, as Bob indicated earlier. Rather than having kind of a set number that was equal for everybody, right? We created a number that would reflect different demographics, right? And different regions of the state, right? Because costs in the Chicago area are higher than the costs in some of the other regions of the state, right? So we wanted to reflect regional cost differences too. But we built on work that was done by National Lewis. They had done kind of a bit of an adequacy study back in like, I don't want to say like 2010, Bob. It was
somewhere in there,
right? So we built on their work. There was also a national group. I think it was Odin and Picus,
something like that. Picus, I think.
And, you know, they had done some work that was incorporated in a handful of other states' education funding stuff. And so we took the other one that people used to always hold up as a model, right, was the state of Massachusetts, right? Mm-hmm. And so we looked at kind of some of their model, right? So our adequacy model kind of picked pieces from what National Lewis did, what Odin Picus did, what the state of Massachusetts did, right? And I think that, you know, we had at some point, I mean, the adequacy model, I think we finished up with over 30 to 34 different elements, right, that would define what an adequate education would be, right? And certainly your low income, your English language learners, and some of your high incidence, low impact special ed population would influence that. And obviously very different than the approach that previous state funding had taken, because now we had a different adequacy target for every one of the 850 districts in the state. And it ranged from like $10,000 a student up to $16,000, $17,000 a student, right? And then when we started engaging people, that just felt better to people, right? And we used EdRed groups, right, as some of the early sounding boards for that adequacy model.
And because it was built from the ground up, there were debates on what target class size should be for high school, what target class size should be for middle school, what it should be for elementary and for kindergarten. For high school, a big debate was what the teaching load should be. Should they, have 2 periods off or 3 periods off, or how many extracurriculars should there be? And so all of those could be debated and tweaked without changing the fundamental concept of every district needed to have an adequacy number. High school districts and elementary districts, they have different characteristics of the class sizes and extracurriculars, but we very consciously decided that unit districts and elementary and high school districts wouldn't be treated any differently. Under the old formula actually favored unit districts. It required less local contribution from unit districts than it did from a combined high school and elementary district. I have no idea why. It just did. It wasn't a major difference, but it was a difference. But this new formula was specifically designed so that it was school-based, not district-based.
Yeah. So if you look at the adequacy model, right, there's a set of assumptions for kind of pre-K through 5, right? There's a set for 6, 7, and 8 middle school, and then there's a set for high school. So we were able to eliminate some of these differences in the old state formula between the 3 different district types by able to break out the population by those grade levels.
So that was step 1, and was a very important step, because then when you aggregated that together, it was very obvious, and the EFAB had already confirmed that the state was greatly underfunding, regardless of what local contribution would be. And so that was an important thing for people to get their heads around, and to a certain extent, to get legislators to accept that a model could acknowledge the fact that the state was underfunding. We had gotten some initial feedback saying, well, we can't ever put out a number that says the state's inadequately funding the schools. And we're like, mathematically, there's no way to come up with a number that's justifiable that doesn't show that the state isn't, underfunding the schools. And so, that was sort of one barrier to break down by getting everyone to agree this is reasonable class sizes. This isn't, gold-plated education with everyone having class sizes of 10 and, but we did allow for the fact that, you did have to pay for subs. You did have to pay for principals and assistant principals and office staff and a few other components. They don't make a huge difference, But instead of just assuming that they were zero, there were numbers in there and people could, debate and say this should be 10% higher or whatever. It made for a lot of good discussion. And then it also meant that when people said, well, this number's too high, you could say, okay, tell us what assumption is unreasonable. Yeah, we can get this number lower if you have class sizes of 35. Here's what happens to the number. Is that, really what you're proposing? And the legislature, yeah, no, we're not really proposing class sizes of 35. And then you'd say, okay, well, then here we are. So then that went to the second, and probably the piece that we contributed the most on was this concept of a local capacity percent that said what percent of the funding for a school district should be local and what should be state. The state constitution has the wording, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, about primary responsibility for funding, and that was always taken to should be at least 50%, 50.01% or whatever. And so we set our model so that the state, on an average across the entire state, would be paying for 50%. And so we did that by some math that, for people who've done, grading and stuff, it's a normal curve equivalent. So that you build in the usual normal curve and said, where are districts on this normal curve equivalent, with, the average, and the factor that we used was EAV of the district divided by the adequacy number. And then we just put it into a normal curve equivalent calculation, setting the mean at 50%. And then that then resulted in a normal distribution, with some districts being as low as 1 or 2%, some being at the 99th percentile. And we said, okay, that's a good starting point for the local capacity percent. If you're an average district, you should be paying about 50%, because that's the state's target. If you're a wealthy district, maybe you're only paying, gain 5 or 10% from the state. If you're a very property poor district, that the vast majority of your funding should come from the state. And we decided that the pure normal curve equivalent just didn't make a lot of sense, because some districts would be getting no money, and they already were currently getting some, as well as there were some things that should be state responsibilities. So one of the early decisions was that the maximum local capacity percent would be 90%, so that every district was expected to get at least 10% state funding. We had initially said that no district should not have to contribute 10%, but there were so few districts under that, and they were so outliers, that we said, there's no reason to set a floor on it and say that even the poorest district should have to pay 10% of it. The reality is, I don't think there are any districts that are under 10%, but it isn't in the code as a minimum, unlike the 90% maximum. That was the big chunk of what was the local capacity target. And then you multiplied that out times the adequacy and said, well, here's how much should be coming from local, and looked at what the state was already giving you, the corporate personal property replacement tax, the CPPRT, and a couple other factors. And the third step was to determine where every district was on the adequacy. So, okay, here was how much local they were supposed to be contributing. Here's how much they were getting from the state currently. Here's how much they were getting from CPPRT. There was an adjustment made in the summer of 2017 to add in some real receipts, that if districts had taxing capacity that was above their local capacity percent, that there was some of that was counted towards your adequacy. But then the adequacy number was calculated, and that number ranged from, I think at the low of like 40 or 50%, all the way up to some districts that were at a couple 100%, that, were outliers. Often they weren't collecting that much. It was just they had the capacity to collect that much. And so, that was the next step, was calculating that adequacy percent for every district. And then the fourth step was the tier assignment, and I'll let Brian talk about that. That was a lot of his thoughts there.
Bob, you make that local contribution thing seem easy. It was not. So, we built this model, right, of the 850 districts in the state. And once we had the adequacy number, right, and we knew we wanted to keep part of our objective in this, right, was to keep a hold harmless on existing revenue, right? So, as Bob says, we're picking all this different state revenue sources out, right? But then the question came to be, about taxes, right? And our first iteration on this actually used tax rates, right? Mm-hmm. And we said, okay, we don't want to use everyone's individual tax rates. We actually did calculations on kind of the median in the state, and we tried to apply that, right? The results didn't give us, right? One of the things that we had the advantage of once we built the adequacy model, now we had data for 850 school districts that we could test these different approaches on, right? And we didn't like the results that we were getting with the tax rate, right? And I mean, we played with that. I think Bob, we probably played for that for 6 or 8 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And the problem with the tax rate, there's a couple of problems with the tax rate, right? One, the tax rate is an all-encompassing rate, but in our model, in our adequacy model, we didn't cover every aspect of a school district, right? So the tax rate doesn't really match up with the limited scope of adequacy. Plus, you had the complications of elementary unit high school districts. You had the complication of the PTEL legislation, right? That limits some counties, but not all counties. So after playing around with tax rates for the longest time, we discovered, man, this isn't working, right? And so in trying to figure out what was next, we knew that kind of an EAV compared to adequacy made some sense, right? But how to actually interpret that into the funding formula wasn't necessarily the easiest thing. And Bob, I credit you. I think you had the idea of using kind of a normalized distribution based on the data in the state, right? And that had the advantage of taking school districts that were significantly lower than the median in the state when it came to comparing EAV to adequacy. And you say, okay, I'm only going to expect them to contribute 15% of adequacy from their property values, right? Or those that were significantly over the mean, maybe you say, I'm expecting you to do 85. By doing that, we were able, I think, effectively to identify school districts that were most in need of additional funds, right? And we were able to kind of separate them out. And part of the dialogue at the time was also trying to look at tax relief for some school districts, right? Because you have some school districts, and I include mine and other EdRed districts in this, right, where the EAV levels are real high and the tax rates are really low. And there's other school districts that don't have big EAV per student. And their tax rate may be more than double the tax rate of other people who are generating a lot more revenue. So this approach kind of took tax rates out of it altogether in terms of prioritizing where the state funds could come in. And if the state funds ended up going to help a district be able to cut their tax burden or keep it flat or whatever it is, that was viewed as a positive. So I think that particular piece of this, was a pretty significant piece in terms of cracking the code, if you will. And during this process, right, when we were trying to develop the adequacy model and this particular kind of allocation, we were using EdRed districts, particularly a lot of business officials at EdRed districts. We started looping in kind of some of our legislative friends, LUDA, LEND, SCOPE, right? And we were having working sessions going through all these numbers, right? And when we hit on this, it seemed like it was starting to feel right. Districts that needed more money, right, were coming up to the top on the list, and districts that didn't were going down to the bottom. So it started feeling good to this broader group.
Right, particularly the South Cook group. One of the things that's often overlooked is many of the South Cook districts have educational tax rates that are 2, 3, 4 times what the Ed Red district's tax rates are. And so this sort of myth that if people just wanted good education, they could tax more was very clear from the numbers, just wasn't true, that there just simply wasn't enough EAV that they could be taxing at 4 times the tax rate and still not be generating enough money to hit an adequacy level. And that was something that particularly our work with Scope helped make sure that this formula tried to address, rather than doing it by tax rate, which really punished low EAV districts unintentionally, but indirectly punished low EAV districts because, even if they hit that tax rate, it just wasn't enough money for them. And so there was a lot of effort made to try to make the implied tax rates more equitable. Again, tax rates were an output of this formula as opposed to an input of the formula. But onto tiers.
So then once we had those pieces, right? You got the adequacy piece, you got kind of the existing state revenues, you got kind of an expectation from EAV, right? Then we could kind of rank the districts from those that were farthest away from adequacy and some that were above. There were a handful of districts that were still above adequacy, right? Because we had the model, we were able to kind of play around with different parameters in terms of what seemed fair. We started out back then putting a number of 90% of adequacy, saying those that were over 90% of adequacy, right, probably don't need as much of the first group of funds as those that are significantly below 90%. We allocated 1% of new revenue to those group that was over 90%, right? And saying 99% of new funds would go to those that are less than, right? And then honestly, it was just as simple as the model was to try to say the farther you were away from adequacy, the more money you should get. So just for simplicity's sake, we created the tiers, right? So tier 1 was the farthest away from adequacy. Tier 2 was between tier 1 and 90%. Tier 3 was 90 to 100, and then tier 4 was everything over 100, right? And it really was as simple as saying, with the concept of the hold harmless, we're going to take all new money and we're going to allocate it to those that are farthest away from adequacy. Those are districts that need those new funds the most. And even though there's a lot of Ed Red districts who, probably would be in line to get more revenue under the old system, I think everybody saw this as a fair system for the state's education fund, right? That it should be focused to those that are farthest away from adequacy, which means they either have a very low EAV, they have high percentage of ELL, low income, special ed kids, right? And that's where new money should be focused. And all the study groups that we met with for that year period of time seemed to embrace that approach.
So if there was this agreement of fairness, there had to be this couldn't have been a smooth process. Like there had to have been criticism, critiques. What were those? And how did you all at the time respond to those?
I think the biggest thing...
Bob, let's break it up a little. Let's talk about the adequacy piece. Do you remember any significant pushback on the adequacy piece?
Yes, the initial had class sizes of 15 for K to 3 or K to 2, I think it was. And then that got compromised to, I believe, 20, but tier 1 schools got calculated at 15 or something like that. But there was pushback on the 15 for K to 2, which was the national recommendation for class size for what is considered early childhood under 8. There was also pushback on the technology spending, and that one got bifurcated a little bit. And I think tier 1 and tier 2 schools got a slightly higher calculation for technology spending. As I already mentioned, there was a lot of debate over the number of specials, extracurriculars that you should have at the high school level which impacts staffing. That if a kid can take 3 out of 6 periods as specials and has lunch, then teachers are only teaching a certain percent. And there was a lot of conversation about that. There was conversation about special extracurriculars. How much should be funded by the state for extracurriculars, and I think we left a fairly low level in that. And then obviously what should be out of the formula. The 4 main things that are out of the formula are the low incidence, high cost special ed, because they don't fit well with a numerical averaging thing, because you don't have 0.2 kids with this special need. You either have 1 or 0, and the average doesn't represent what any district has. Transportation was taken out very early. Again, it wasn't part of the old general state aid formula, nor was special ed. Early childhood, the same thing. We couldn't figure out how to get it in, and it wasn't part of the old formula, so we left that out. And then the 4th one that we left out was, and I'm blanking on it.
Capital expenditures.
That, again, that wasn't part of the original evidence-based model, but we did feel that we needed to put in, and did get in there, some maintenance expenses. Some average maintenance expenses for buildings. And that was sort of a question as to how much that should be, but worked with some state average. Right. But the capital was one that, capital, transportation, early childhood, and special ed were all outside of the original formula and remained outside of it. Some of the other discussions were what state funds should be included in the baseline.
The hold harmless.
The hold harmless, if you will. As well as could the federal funding, particularly Title I dollars, be included. And my understanding is that Title I dollars could not be included by federal law. And that was also part of the reason for the 90%, was that, we knew that some federal money would be coming into districts. And so 100% wasn't necessarily necessary, but 90 was sort of a reasonable proxy.
So if you think about the 35 elements that make up adequacy, right, and the values that go with those, right, every time that we expanded our group in terms of review, we went back over that with everyone, right? And there was always conversation about whether this is appropriate. Should we modify this way, right? So, it starts with Bob and I, right? And then we expanded to the EdRed group, right? We had the EdRed business officials were a phenomenal resource during this entire process to help us kind of calibrate those adequacy numbers, right? And then once we got that to a certain point, right, then we brought in, Ludo, Len, Scope, right, and got their perspectives on all the numbers, right? And we made presentations to them. We're going through all this stuff, right? We're doing some give and take, making some adjustments, right? And then when we start getting to the state groups, Mike Jacoby representing kind of the alliance at the time, we got Ralph Martiri involved, right? They're looking at it too. They're asking critical questions. Do we modify this? Where's this? What's the best data to use, right? So all of those, the details on just the adequacy model were kind of, each time we would expand the group, the review group, we're revisiting all those assumptions again, right? And that's just, I think, the nature of the process, right? And then finally, when it starts getting to the legislators themselves, right, they actually didn't have as many changes to the adequacy model as you might think. I think they relied on all the other reviews that had gone there, but there was a lot of calories burned trying to get to the right set of numbers.
Right. And yeah, one number that we haven't talked a lot about, but we spent probably 2 months doing was the numbers that should be used for teacher salaries and how they should be regionalized. And yeah, yeah, we looked at, average salary, we looked at median salary, we looked at regionalizing the salary before averaging it or after averaging it, and all sorts of things to come up with the number that people ended up feeling was fairly robust and could be justified. And then once that was locked in, that was kept, but the regionalization was changed 2 or 3 times. I remember one of the times we did a regionalization that the 1.0 number happened to be Peoria. And so it fit very well with the expression of how will that play in Peoria. It's like, you're the average.
It's right in the middle of the state too, right?
Right in the middle of the state, right in the middle of the average. But I think it ended up a different calculation got used and they're no longer 1.0. But, all of those things made a difference in working with things. But part of the advantage of having the model and the spreadsheet before legislative language got drafted was that you could have the debate about what were the better numbers when you had numbers. One of the things that had happened with Andy Minar's first approach is some of the legislative language was drafted, and I think internally some numbers had been created, but ISB hadn't run numbers on what the formula would mean, and it sounded good in practice, and it really was a fairly good system if you put more money into it, but the legislation didn't call for putting more money into it, and it passed the Senate, and then ISB ran some calculations, and with no additional money going in, and it was very clear that a whole bunch of districts would be losers. And so one of the things we were trying to do is, before getting anywhere near the legislative language process, making sure that everyone was comfortable with where the numbers would end up, because I was also less involved, but was going down to Springfield in, I think, 2006, when House Bill 750, the property tax swap, was proposed. And we were on the bus when a Tribune article hit that showed who the winners and losers would be. And everyone on the bus instantly knew that it was a non-starter. There were too many loser communities. And it was like, why didn't someone run these numbers before they got everyone on buses to go down? Because people were advocating for something that in principle sounded good, but they had no real sense of how it would impact their community or anything else. It took the Tribune to run numbers. And it's just like, you can't, it's too hard. The funding is too complex for people to have an intuitive sense of, is change A good for me or bad for me? And if it's bad for me, is it something I can live with or not, without actually seeing the numbers? And so, we made a sort of commitment that we would run numbers for all the districts, not just for the ed-red districts, and be as transparent as possible with the numbers. That took time. We first met in September 2015. The legislation passed in August of 2017. So it was nearly 2 years. And there were a whole lot more people involved than us. For a major change like that, it takes time.
Yeah, and so if I go backwards to your question about kind of where some of the discussions and points were, and couple it with Bob's last point about the data here. As we expanded those review groups out, lots of people had questions about the adequacy, and there's some give and take there, right? I get that. I think that was kind of normal. As we started though getting to how we compared kind of the state funding and the resources from our contribution, our local contribution percentage, right? We explained it, but there weren't a lot of questions or pushback on that. And a lot of that was driven by what Bob was saying, because we could show them runs of here's districts that are going to benefit the most, here's districts in the middle, here's districts that aren't going to get a lot of money, right? And as a general rule, that just felt good to people, right? They understood, rather than trying to look at the formula and understand it, we could tell them what it would mean for their district, what it would mean for other districts around the state. And it helped us calibrate kind of a lot of the numbers, because that's really what you're trying to do, saying these districts are going to benefit the most from new money, right? And honestly, I would say almost everybody that we talked to was okay with understanding that there are districts that need much more money than they're currently getting, and it's okay to give them more money than others, right? I think there really was an objective viewpoint with almost everybody we talked to. Now, once you got to that final stage where you got the legislators involved, then there were kind of different adjustments and negotiations to fine tune the formula so that it had certain desired effects of certain legislators. And that's where I think certainly you had to be flexible. And Bob, I know you remember all this stuff too. And I think Bob and I were both in a position of saying, look, we kind of created something that we thought was pretty good, pretty pure, but you can't, it's more important to get something passed, right? So that's where there's always in that final legislative process, you're going to have some things that are going to change, that it's going to impact certain districts more than others, but it's more important to get it passed.
This concludes part 1 of a 2-part conversation. Join us next month as we continue the discussion on Give Me the Deets on EBF with Brian Battle and Bob Spatz.